A sharp crack echoed across the courtyard. A mobility aid skidded across the stone, coming to rest in the dirt. And Guan Yin, the son of the city's most feared man, lay on the ground while the elite students of the academy jeered. Hundreds of phones were already recording, their lenses gleaming like hungry eyes. The little dragon can't even crawl. His crutch was snatched from the ground and brandished like a conquered flag. But what happened next caught everyone at the academy off guard. Because from the shadow of the brick archway, a boy who had spent the year being invisible stepped forward. David S. Perron didn't shout, he didn't threaten. But before the bullies could even land another blow, they were the ones eating the dust of the courtyard. By sunset, the footage had ignited the internet. By dinner, a powerful Korean Mafia boss sat in the back of a dark sedan, staring at the screen. And his next move? It sent a shiver through the entire city. Guan Yin understood the weight of a name better than anyone. To the world, he was the heir to an empire built on steel and silence, the son of Ryu Seok. But inside the walls of the academy, that name was a target, not a shield. His mother was a memory of soft lullabies and the scent of jasmine, lost to a tragedy his father never spoke of. She had always told him, "True strength isn't in the legs that carry you, Guan, but in the heart that refuses to stop." But at the academy, the heart didn't matter. They measured his worth by the rhythm of his limp. They mocked the Mafia prince who couldn't even defend his own tray. He was surrounded by gold and glass, yet he was starving for the one thing his father's billions couldn't buy: respect. Across that same courtyard moved a student whose presence was as quiet as a coming storm. David S. Perron didn't have a syndicate or a title. He had a code, a legacy of protection handed down through a family that believed power was a debt you owed to the defenseless. His father had carved a single rule into his mind: never seek the fight, never waste your strength on pride, stand for those who cannot stand for themselves. On that humid Tuesday afternoon, two boys from vastly different worlds were about to meet in the middle of a circle of hate. And neither the bullies, nor the calculating father watching the video from a leather-bound office, were prepared for the moment the invisible boy decided to speak with his hands. Guan Yin lived in a house made of glass and silence. The sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city was a masterpiece of modern architecture, but to him it felt like a museum where he was just another fragile exhibit. Every morning began the same way. The rhythmic click-thud of his crutch against the polished marble floors, a sound that seemed to mock the stillness of the massive hallways. He spent most of his hours in the library, a room filled with thousands of books that promised adventures his legs would never allow him to take. From his window, he could see the training grounds where his father's men moved with lethal precision, their bodies disciplined and fast. Guan Yin would watch them, his hand instinctively gripping the cold metal of his mobility aid. He was the heir to the most powerful syndicate in the country, the little dragon of the Ryu bloodline, yet he felt more like a ghost haunting his own home. His father, Ryu Seok, was a man defined by edges. Everything about him was sharp, from the crease in his dark, tailored trousers to the calculated way he spoke. Ryu Seok didn't lead with outbursts of rage, he led with a cold, terrifying clarity. To him, the world was a chessboard, and every move had to be decisive. At the long, mahogany dining table, the distance between father and son felt wider than the city itself. Ryu Seok would sit at the head, his eyes fixed on a tablet, reviewing shipments, territory maps, and balance sheets. He provided Guan Yin with the best doctors, the most expensive tutors, and a life of absolute security, but he rarely provided his presence. "The academy reports your grades are perfect," Ryu Seok said one evening, his voice low and smooth, never looking up from his screen. It wasn't a compliment, it was a clinical observation of a requirement being met. "Yes, father," Guan replied, his voice small against the vastness of the room. "Good. Weakness of the body is a challenge, Guan Yin, but weakness of the mind is a choice. Do not make that choice." Ryu Seok finally looked up, his expression serious and focused. His brows were slightly furrowed, not with anger, but with the weight of a man who viewed his son as a legacy that needed to be hardened. He saw the limp as a variable to be managed, a flaw to be compensated for with intellect and ruthlessness. He didn't see the boy who missed his mother's soft laughter, or the son who just wanted to be told he was enough. As Ryu Seok stood to take a call that would determine the fate of a rival dockyard, he adjusted his tie with a quick, disciplined motion. He left without a backward glance. Guanin sat alone in the echoing room, the remnants of his dinner cold. He realized then that in his father's world, you were either a predator or a liability. And as he looked down at the crutch leaning against the expensive chair, he wondered if he would ever be anything more than a shadow in the dragon's empire. He was surrounded by power, yet he had never felt more powerless. While Guanin grew up in a palace of marble and silence, David S. Perrin's world was built on the steady rhythm of a boxing gym and the warm weight of a legacy. His home was a modest apartment filled with the scent of cedar and the low hum of old jazz, but his true education happened in the basement of a community center 3 blocks away. There, under the flickering hum of fluorescent lights, David's father, a man with hands like iron and a heart like a sanctuary, taught him the meaning of weight. Not the weight of the weights they lifted, but the weight of responsibility. David's father had spent 20 years as a first responder, a man whose job was to run into the chaos while everyone else ran away. He didn't carry a weapon. He carried a code. "Look at your hands, David," his father said one evening after a grueling sparring session. David was 12, his knuckles sore and his breathing heavy. He had just successfully landed a flurry of punches, his chest puffed with the sudden, intoxicating rush of dominance. "I'm getting stronger, Pop," David had said, a small, arrogant grin tugging at his lips. His father didn't smile back. He sat David down on a worn leather bench, the air thick with the smell of sweat and perseverance. "Strength is a dangerous thing if it isn't tethered to a purpose. Any coward can throw a punch to prove he's the biggest man in the room. That's not strength, son. That's ego, and ego is just a loud mask for fear." David frowned, the adrenaline cooling into confusion. "Then why do we train? Why do we learn to fight if we aren't supposed to use it?" "We train so that we never have to," his father replied, his voice a calm, immovable anchor. "We learn to fight so that when the world gets loud and cruel, we can be the silence that stops it. A real protector doesn't seek to break people. He seeks to break the cycle of harm. Your power isn't about proving you can hurt someone, it's about proving you have the discipline to keep them safe, even from themselves." He placed a heavy hand on David's shoulder, his eyes reflecting a lifetime of standing in the gap for the defenseless. "The world is full of boys who want to be kings, David, but the world is starving for men who are willing to be shields. Never let your hands move faster than your heart." From that day on, David viewed his body differently. His muscles weren't tools for conquest, they were an armor he wore for the sake of others. He learned to move with a fluid, deceptive grace, focusing on redirection rather than impact. He studied the way a storm's fury could be neutralized by the stillness of the earth. By the time he arrived at the elite academy on a scholarship earned through grit and intellect, David was a ghost in the hallways. He saw the way the wealthy students preened and postured, their cruelty a byproduct of their bottomless boredom. He saw the little dragon Guanin retreating further into himself with every sneer directed at his limp. David stayed in the shadows, his father's voice a constant, quiet hum in his mind. He didn't want the spotlight. He didn't want the glory of the win. But as he watched the circle of bullies tighten around the boy with the crutch, he felt the familiar weight settling in his bones. The shield was ready. He knew that soon, the discipline he had cultivated in that humid basement would be the only thing standing between a boy's remaining dignity and the hungry eyes of the crowd. At Crestwood Academy, the air was thin with the scent of expensive cologne and the silent pressure of status. It was a place where reputation was the only currency that mattered, and in the digital age, that currency was minted in likes, shares, and views. The grand courtyard, with its manicured hedges and stone arches, was less of a campus and more of a stage. Every interaction was a potential performance, and every student was a director waiting for a moment of chaos to capture. There was a specific kind of hunger that lived in the hallways, a restless, collective appetite for the content of human misery. To the elite students, life didn't happen unless it was viewed through a high-definition lens. They didn't just witness a conflict. They curated it. They didn't just see a victim, they framed one. Guanin felt that hunger every time he stepped out of his car. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the way the ambient noise would sharpen into a predatory hum as he adjusted his crutch. He was the ultimate prize for their digital trophies, the disabled heir to a criminal empire, a boy whose physical struggle provided the perfect contrast to their curated perfection. "Check the feed," a girl in a designer blazer whispered as Guanin passed, her eyes never leaving her screen. "The Dragon Challenge is trending again." The challenge was a cruel, unspoken game played in the dark corners of group chats. It was a contest to see who could capture the most humiliating footage of the boy who couldn't run. A stumble in the hallway was worth 100 likes. A spilled drink was worth 1,000. To them, Guanin wasn't a person with a grieving heart or a brilliant mind. He was a viral opportunity. David watched this from the periphery, his back against a cold stone pillar. He saw the way the phones were held, not like tools, but like weapons. He saw the red lights of recording apps glowing in the dim light of the corridors, tiny digital eyes that never blinked and never showed mercy. He recognized the look in the eyes of the popular seniors, the way they scouted for vulnerability like sharks sensing blood in the water. It was a culture built on the philosophy that if it wasn't recorded, it didn't count, and if it was cruel, it was engagement. They lived for the rush of the upload, the dopamine hit of a notification, and the safety of being behind the camera rather than in front of it. They thought the glass of their screens protected them from the consequences of their apathy. As the lunch hour approached, the tension in the courtyard reached a fever pitch. The king of the school, a senior named Jason, with a smile as bright and hollow as a neon sign, was already positioning his inner circle. They weren't looking for a fight. They were looking for a show. They were waiting for the moment the little dragon would find himself alone in the center of the square. David straightened his posture, his hands steady at his sides. He could see the hungry crowd beginning to form a loose, expectant ring. He saw the phones coming out, the screens illuminating faces filled with a terrifying, hollow excitement. They were ready to turn a boy's pain into a headline. They wanted the crash, the fall, and the viral aftermath. But as David stepped out from the shadows of the archway, he knew that the one thing the crowd never recorded was the moment the silence decided to push back. The humidity of the afternoon seemed to cling to the courtyard, thickening the air as the circle tightened. Guanin stood at the center, his knuckles white as he gripped the stone bench for support. Jason and his inner circle moved with the practiced grace of predators who had never been hunted, their laughter sharp and jagged. They weren't just mocking him anymore, they were looking for a physical breaking point. "Let's see how the dragon flies," Jason sneered, his voice projecting for the benefit of the dozens of lenses aimed at the scene. With a sudden, mocking shove, he sent Guanin's crutch skittering across the pavement. The metal clattered violently, a lonely sound that was quickly drowned out by the rhythmic chanting of the crowd. Guanin stumbled, his leg buckling as he struggled to maintain his balance against the bench. Tears of frustration and heat pricked his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He looked up, searching for a single face of empathy, but all he saw was a sea of black glass screens and the glowing red dots of recording apps. The shove that followed was harder, intended to put Guanin on the ground. He hit the stone with a dull thud, the impact jarring his spine. The roar of the crowd intensified, a visceral, hungry sound. Jason stepped over him, looming like a conqueror, his foot hovering inches from Guanin's hand. "Your father's money didn't buy you much of a spine, did it?" In the shadow of the archway, David S. Perrin felt the world go quiet. The noise of the jeering students faded into a distant, muffled hum, replaced by the steady, heavy beat of his own heart. He thought of the basement gym, the smell of old leather, and his father's voice. "We train so that we never have to. We learn to fight so we can be the silence that stops the storm." David didn't rush, he didn't shout. With a slow, deliberate motion, he slipped his backpack off his shoulders and set it gently on the ground. He adjusted the cuffs of his uniform, his movements fluid and precise. The students closest to him began to notice, their cameras pivoting toward the newcomer. A ripple of confusion spread through the circle as David stepped over the invisible line that everyone else had drawn to keep themselves safe. He walked into the eye of the storm with the calm of a man walking through a garden. His expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed not on the bullies, but on the boy struggling to push himself up from the dirt. The crowd's chant faltered, dying out as David stopped exactly 3 paces from Jason. The contrast was absolute. Jason was a portrait of loud, unearned ego. David was a study in quiet, tempered iron. "Pick up the crutch," David said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that seemed to anchor the entire courtyard. Jason blinked, his smirk faltering for a fraction of a second before twisting into a sneer of disbelief. "And who are you supposed to be? His bodyguard?" David didn't answer with words. He simply shifted his weight, his feet finding the earth in a way that signaled the end of the game. He looked at Guanin, offering a brief, steady nod that promised the boy he was no longer alone. Then, he turned his gaze back to Jason. The line in the sand had been drawn, and for the first time in the history of the academy, someone was standing on the other side. Jason didn't wait. To him, David's stillness wasn't a warning. It was an invitation. With a roar of performative rage, he lunged forward, throwing a heavy, swinging right hook intended to end the confrontation before it truly began. David didn't flinch. He didn't even raise his fists. As the blow approached, he simply stepped into the arc of the punch, his body moving like a shadow passing through a doorway. He caught Jason's wrist with a touch as light as a whisper and used the bully's own momentum to guide him past. Jason stumbled, his own force carrying him into a clumsy sprawl against the very stone bench where Guanin sat. The crowd gasped, the sea of phones wavering as the predator suddenly looked like a confused child. "You're going to regret that," Jason hissed, scrambling up. He signaled to his 2 friends, and the 3 of them closed in. It was no longer a spectacle. It was a hunt. They attacked simultaneously, a chaotic blur of desperate shoves and swinging arms. David moved with a fluid, deceptive grace that made the air around him seem to bend. He was the eye of the hurricane, calm, centered, and untouchable. When the second boy tried to grab him, David simply pivoted, his footwork precise and silent. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and gave a sharp downward tug, using the attacker's aggressive lunge to send him face first into the dirt. There was no violence in David's movements, only physics. He didn't strike, he redirected. He didn't break bones, he broke their balance. Jason rushed in again, his face contorted with the realization that he was being humiliated without being hit. He swung wildly, but David was already gone, reappearing at Jason's flank. With a seamless transition, David caught Jason's elbow and guided it upward, causing the bully to trip over his own feet. Jason collapsed onto the pavement, the wind leaving his lungs in a sharp, pathetic wheeze. Silence descended over the courtyard, heavy and suffocating. The hundreds of recording phones remained raised, but the jeering had stopped. The little dragon challenge had been replaced by a reality no one was prepared for. The most powerful boys in the school were on the ground, and the boy who put them there hadn't even closed his hand into a fist. David stood over them, his breathing as steady as if he were sitting in a quiet classroom. He didn't look at the cameras, and he didn't look at the fallen bullies with triumph. There was no ego in his stance, only the quiet authority of a shield that had done its job. He reached down and picked up Guanin's crutch, wiping a smudge of dirt from the handle with his sleeve. He turned toward Guanin and extended the mobility aid, his eyes softening with a silent respect. "Strength isn't about who stays on their feet," David said softly, his voice cutting through the stunned silence of the courtyard. "It's about who refuses to let someone else stay down." Guanin took the crutch, his fingers trembling but his gaze fixed on David. For the first time, the little dragon didn't look like a victim. He stood up, leaning on the metal but standing taller than he ever had in his life. The crowd remained frozen, their screens capturing the image of the 2 boys standing together in the center of the ring. The hunger for cruelty had been replaced by a sudden, chilling realization. The silence of the protector had finally spoken, and the echo was going to reach much further than the academy walls. The back of the black sedan was a mobile sanctuary of leather and cold glass, isolated from the noise of the city. Ryu-sok sat in the darkness, the blue light of a tablet illuminating the sharp, disciplined lines of his face. He was a man who moved empires with a single word, yet in this moment, he was as motionless as a statue. The notification had come through an encrypted channel, flagged as a high-priority mention of his son's name. He pressed play, expecting a report on grades or a security update. Instead, he was met with the jagged, handheld footage of a courtyard he paid a fortune for Guanin to attend. His jaw tightened as he watched the crutch skitter across the stone. He watched his son, the heir to the Ryu bloodline, struggle in the dirt, while a crowd of children with expensive watches and hollow hearts jeered. For a moment, the controlled anger that defined Ryu-sok threatened to break its banks. He saw the shove. He saw the juice stain Guanin's shirt. He saw the red recording lights, the hungry eyes of the crowd that viewed his son's pain as entertainment. Then, the camera panted. A boy Ryu-sok didn't recognize stepped into the frame. He watched with a predator's keen eye as the black student set down his bag with a deliberate, haunting calm. Ryu-sok leaned forward, his brows furrowed, his grip on the tablet tightening until his knuckles turned white. He expected a brawl, a clumsy, violent exchange of egos. What he saw instead was a masterclass in restraint. He watched the boy David move like a shadow caught in a breeze. There was no hesitation, no wasted energy. When the bullies attacked, David didn't strike them down. He let them fall. Ryu-sok's analytical mind immediately recognized the high level of discipline required to neutralize 3 attackers without once closing a fist. It was a philosophy he understood but rarely practiced. The power of the void. The video ended with David handing the crutch back to Guanin. Ryu-sok watched that final moment 3 times. He didn't focus on the bullies or the crowd. He focused on his son's face, the way Guanin looked at the stranger not with fear, but with a dawning sense of dignity. Ryu-sok lowered the tablet, the screen reflecting in his dark, calculating eyes. He had spent years hardening Guanin, believing that isolation and intellectual rigor were the only ways to compensate for a weak body. He had provided everything money could buy, yet he had left his son to face a circle of wolves alone. A stranger with nothing but a code had done more for the little dragon in 3 minutes than Ryu-sok had done in years. He looked out the window at the passing city lights, his expression serious and focused. He wasn't thinking about retaliation. Not yet. He was thinking about the debt. In his world, a debt of honor was the only thing more important than power. He tapped the glass partition, signaling his driver. "Change the schedule for tomorrow," Ryu-sok said, his voice a low, vibrating hum of intent. "I am going to the academy, and I want everything we have on the boy in the video." The car glided through the night, a silent dragon moving toward a reckoning. Ryu-sok had seen the video, and for the first time in his life, the most powerful man in the city realized he had been looking at the wrong kind of strength. The morning sun hit the glass towers of the Ryu corporate headquarters, but for the first time in a decade, the executive elevator remained idle. In his private office, Ryu-sok stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city wake up. His reflection showed a man who looked exactly like the power he wielded, immaculate, unyielding, and solitary. His assistant knocked softly, stepping into the room with a tablet and a frantic expression. "Sir, the board is waiting for the port acquisition briefing. The investors from Seoul have already arrived. We have exactly 4 minutes before." "Cancel it," Ryu-sok said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. The assistant blinked, frozen. "Sir? This is a $3 billion merger. It's the culmination of 2 years of—" "Cancel everything," Ryu-sok repeated, turning slowly. His expression was serious and focused, the furrow in his brow deeper than usual. The merger, the dinner with the district attorney, the internal security audit, push it all to next week. Or next month, it doesn't matter. He walked to his desk and picked up the tablet he had been staring at half the night. The video of the courtyard was paused on a frame of Guan, huddled on the ground. Ryu-sok felt a hollow ache in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced since his wife's funeral. He had spent years convinced that by expanding his empire, he was building a fortress for his son. He had mistaken provision for protection. He had given Guanin guards, tutors, and trust funds. But he had left the boy to navigate a world of wolves without a father's hand on his shoulder. "I have been building a kingdom for a boy I barely know," Ryusok murmured, more to himself than to his assistant. He realized now that while he was busy conquering territories, Guan-in had been learning a different lesson. His son hadn't been learning to lead. He had been learning to be small. He had been learning to apologize for his existence, to shrink away from the sunlight because he believed his father's shadow was too large to stand in. The boy in the video, David, had seen the value in Guan-siling, in that Ryusok had only treated as a legacy to be managed. Ryusok adjusted his tie, but not with the usual mechanical precision. His hands felt heavy with the weight of lost time. He didn't want to be the dragon today. He wanted to be a father. He wanted to show Guan-in that he wasn't just a figurehead on a screen or a signature on a tuition check. "Prepare the car," Ryusok commanded, his voice regaining its decisive edge, but this time it was tempered with a new, raw intent. "We aren't going to the office. We are going to the academy, and ensure that the principal is informed. I am not coming for a meeting. I am coming for my son." As he walked out of the office, leaving the billions of dollars of pending deals behind, Ryusok felt a strange, terrifying lightness. He was finally choosing presence over power. He was going to stand beside the boy with the crutch, and for the first time, he didn't care who was recording. The atmosphere in the academy's administrative wing was usually one of hushed elegance, but today, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The principal and the board of directors sat behind a heavy oak table, their faces pale as they stared at the man seated across from them. Ryusok did not lean back. He sat with his hands folded precisely on the table, his sharp dark suit a stark contrast to the academic surroundings. Beside him sat Guan-in, and next to his son, David S. Perrin. In the corner of the room stood Jason and his accomplices, their parents flanking them in a desperate display of wealth and influence. They had arrived ready to argue, to claim it was a misunderstanding or boys being boys. But those arguments died the moment Ryusok placed his tablet on the table and pressed play. The sounds of the courtyard filled the room, the rhythmic chanting, the crash of the crutch, and Guan-in's labored breathing. Ryusok didn't look at the screen. He kept his eyes fixed on the principal. He watched the educators squirm as they were forced to witness the cruelty they had allowed to flourish under the guise of prestige. "You were quick to send an automated notification about a disruption in the courtyard," Ryusok said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that made the glass water carafes on the table tremble. "Yet I see no record of a notification regarding the systematic harassment of my son, or the theft of his mobility aid. Mr. Ryu, we were investigating the facts." The principal began, his voice cracking. "The facts are recorded in 4K resolution by 300 witnesses," Ryusok interrupted, his tone cold and calculated. He turned his gaze toward Jason's father, a man who had tried to offer a handshake minutes earlier. "Your son thought it was entertaining to turn a disability into a viral challenge. He thought his name would protect him from the consequences of his character." The room was silent. Jason, stripped of his crowd and his camera, looked small. He looked like the coward David's father had once described, a boy using a loud mask to hide his fear. Ryusok stood up, the movement so disciplined and sudden that the board members instinctively recoiled. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. "I am not here to ask for an expulsion. That is a matter for the school's failing conscience. I am here to ensure that the truth is the only thing that remains." He looked at David, then at Guan-in. "My son will not be returning to an institution that treats dignity as a luxury. And as for the footage, I have ensured it will remain online. Not as a joke, but as a permanent record of who these boys are when they think no one powerful is watching." The parents of the bullies began to protest, realizing that their sons' futures were being dismantled by the very digital permanence they had weaponized against Guan-in. Ryusok ignored them. He walked over to David and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. It was a gesture of respect from one protector to another. "The reckoning isn't about the punishment," Ryusok said, looking directly at the principal. "It's about the fact that you all watched a boy drown in silence, and it took a stranger to show you what a backbone looks like." He turned to Guan-in and held out his hand. not to lead him, but to stand beside him. As they walked out of the office together, the weight of the Ryu name finally felt like a shield, and for the first time, the dragon was leading with his heart. The heavy iron gates of the estate swung open, but this time, the car didn't stop at the grand entrance. Ryusok signaled the driver to pull over by the edge of the gardens, near the stone path that wound through the jasmine trees. The silence of the estate was no longer suffocating. It was peaceful, a blank canvas for a new beginning. As they stepped out of the car, Guanin moved to head toward his usual sanctuary in the library, but Ryusok reached out, placing a hand gently on his son's shoulder. It wasn't the firm, directive grip of a boss, but the steadying anchor of a father. "Walk with me, Guanin," he said softly. They moved slowly, the click-thud of the crutch matching the rhythm of Ryusok's deliberate footsteps. For the first time, Ryusok didn't look ahead at the horizon or down at a screen. He looked at his son. He saw the strength in the boy's grip and the resilience in his posture, qualities he had overlooked while searching for a version of perfection that didn't exist. "I spent my life building walls to protect you," Ryusok began, his voice reflecting a rare, quiet vulnerability. "I thought that if I made the world fear our name, you would be safe. But I was wrong. I left you behind those walls, and in doing so, I left you alone." Guanin stopped, looking up at his father. The shadow of the dragon seemed smaller now, replaced by a man who was finally letting the light in. "I didn't need a kingdom, Dad. I just needed to know you were in it with me." Ryusok nodded, a tight knot in his chest finally loosening. "David S. Perrin showed me something I had forgotten. He didn't have my armies or my wealth, yet he protected you better than I ever did. He fought with a discipline that didn't come from fear, but from a legacy of honor. He was the catalyst, Guanin. He reminded me that a legacy isn't what you leave behind for someone, it's what you build within them." They reached the center of the garden, where the fountain's water flowed with a constant, fluid grace. Ryusok turned to face his son fully. "From today, things change. No more silence. No more hiding. We will lead this family together. Not through fear, but through the strength David showed us. The strength that stands for those who cannot." In smiled, a genuine bright expression that reached his eyes for the first time in years. He leaned on his crutch, but he felt a different kind of support now, one made of flesh and blood. In the weeks that followed, the story of the invisible protector and the little dragon became a legend within the city. David remained at the academy, a quiet guardian whose presence alone had dismantled the school's toxic hierarchy. And every afternoon, a black sedan would wait at the gates, not just to collect an heir, but to pick up a son. The Ryu legacy was no longer a story of cold steel and shadow. It had become a story of a father who learned to see, a son who learned to stand, and a boy who taught them both that the most powerful move in the world is the one that brings someone else home. The dragon had finally found its heart, and the silence of the estate was finally filled with the sound of a family finding its way back to each other.